Boring History for Sleep: How Ancient Egyptians Brewed Beer Along the Nile. Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping back in time, way back to the banks of the Nile River, in the soft golden haze of ancient Egypt. You feel the warm breeze off the water brush against your face, carrying the earthy scent of river mud and reeds. It's quiet here except for the occasional slap of an oar, or the distant croak of a frog. Civilization hums softly around you, the rhythmic pounding of grain being milled, the muffled voices of workers starting their day. You probably wouldn't survive long in this ancient world, with its scorching sun crocodiles that think you're a snack, and a complete absence of iced coffee. But for now, you're just passing through a guest at the heart of one of history's earliest brewing cultures. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you posted your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself walking along a narrow path that hugs the great river, the Nile, flowing calmly, just a few feet away. The sun is already climbing, and the misty coolness of dawn is giving way to the dry heat of the day. Mud brick houses cluster along the shore, their flat roofs shaded with woven mats. You can hear the low chatter of families starting their morning, a baby crying somewhere in the distance. There's no rush in the air, just the gentle rhythm of life that's tied entirely to the rise and fall of the Nile's waters. As you pass a group of fishermen pulling in their papyrus-netted catch, a sweet, toasty smell drifts toward you. It's faint at first, then stronger, a blend of warm grain and the tang of fermenting yeast. You follow it like a trail, and soon the houses give way to a larger, busier compound. This is no family kitchen. This is a brewery. The Egyptians take beer seriously as bread or water, because for most people, it's safer to drink beer than river water. Historians still argue whether it was the cornerstone of nutrition or simply a refreshing perk, but the reality is, plain beer is life here. You step into the brewery courtyard. It's shaded by tall palm trunks, lashed together with a rope, but the sun still manages to filter through, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Dozens of workers are already hard at work barefoot and moving with a quiet focus. One man tips a basket of grain into a wide ceramic vat, while another stirs slowly with a heavy wooden paddle. You notice how deliberate their movements are, almost ceremonial. Brewing, you realize, is as much art as it is necessity. A woman carrying a jar the size of a toddler brushes past you. She pauses for a moment to glance at the bubbling contents inside the jar and mutters something under her breath, a prayer, or maybe just a quick complaint about the yeast not cooperating. You'll never know, but it makes you smile. Even thousands of years ago, people worried about whether their batch would turn out right. You edge closer to the vats, careful not to trip on the uneven floor, and feel the heat radiating from the fermenting grain. The smell is richer now, malty and sweet, laced with the faint sourness of natural fermentation. You can almost taste it in the back of your throat, though you're not sure you'd want to drink it quite yet. The brewers are busy, but you can tell they're used to curious onlookers. One older man with a sun-worn face waves you closer and scoops up a ladle of frothy liquid, showing you the tiny bubbles rising slowly to the surface. He taps the side of the jar with the ladle handle and says something in a tone that's half reverent, half warning. You nod solemnly, though you understand exactly none of it. Still, you gather that this is a critical stage. If the yeast, the magical invisible partner in the process, fails, the beer will spoil, and all the labor will be for nothing. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians fully understood yeast as we do today, or if they simply believed the gods intervened, but either way, they treated this part of brewing like a sacred trust. The old man sets the ladle down and points you toward the back of the compound, where enormous clay jars stand in neat rows. Each jar is sealed with a thick layer of clay and marked with precise hieroglyphs. These markings don't just say beer, they record which brewery produced it, the batch date, and sometimes even the intended recipient. You imagine palace officials scrutinizing the labels, as carefully as a modern shopper inspecting an organic sticker. A soft bray of a donkey distracts you for a moment. Beyond the brewery walls, farmers are loading grain sacks onto carts. The Nile has recently receded from its yearly flood, leaving behind rich black soil that will nourish the next crop. You realize how much this beer, this simple everyday drink, depends on the river's rhythms. Without the floodwaters to grow barley and emmer wheat, there is no beer, no bread, no life. You lean against the shade of a palm post and close your eyes for a moment. You can hear everything, the soft splash of the Nile against the shore, the rhythmic thump of grain being milled, the low hum of workers talking about anything from last night's dinner to which deity might be in a good mood today. Somewhere, a child giggles as she tries to chase a scruffy dog through the dusty courtyard. It's not dramatic history. It's everyday history, the kind that slips quietly into the background. And yet, without these brewers and their dedication, ancient Egypt would look very different. One of the younger brewers catches your eye and with a mischievous grin holds up a jug of finished beer. It's warm and a little cloudy, but you take a sip anyway. The taste surprises you, sweet, slightly tangy, and just a little gritty from the remaining grain. It's nothing like the crisp lagers of the modern world, but it's satisfying, and you understand why Egyptians drank it daily. You hand the jug back with a nod of appreciation, wiping the foam from your upper lip. The young brewer laughs softly and goes back to work, and you turn toward the open gates of the compound. Beyond them, you can see the shimmering fields of barley swaying in the distance, ready to be harvested for the next batch. You step forward, curious about how this grain glowing gold in the sunlight will make its way from field to jar. You step away from the brewery and head toward the golden shimmer of barley fields, stretching out as far as the eye can see. The air feels drier here, carrying the faint rasp of grain heads rustling together in the breeze. You blink against the sun, which seems to have shifted higher in the sky without you noticing. Everything moves at a measured pace in this landscape. No one is in a hurry. The Nile gives life on its own schedule, and so do the farmers who rely on it. The fields are a patchwork of colors deep green, where the barley still grows tall, fading to sun-bleached gold, where it's nearly ready to harvest. You pause on a low earthen ridge that separates two plots and look around. Farmers stoop over in linen kilts using curved flint sickles to trim stray weeds and check the ripening stalks. A pair of children runs barefoot between rows laughing as they carry baskets of pulled-up weeds, almost as big as themselves. You're struck by the simplicity of the tools. There are no machines roaring, no tractors leaving neat rows in the soil, just human hands, patience, and an understanding of the river's rhythm that's been passed down for generations. One of the farmers notices you watching and beckons you closer. He's wiry and sun-darkened, with shoulders rounded from years of bending over the fields. He holds up a stalk of barley for you to inspect. The grain heads are plump, and a few kernels fall into your palm when he gives it a gentle shake. You roll them between your fingers. They feel warm, almost alive. He nods approvingly and says something about the flood being generous this year. You can't catch every word, but you understand the meaning. Good water equals good harvest, and good harvest equals plenty of beer. As you walk deeper into the fields, you spot a small canal cutting through the barley. Water glitters in the sunlight as it flows slowly from the river. Farmers built this by hand, digging with wooden tools to channel the Nile's overflow into their crops. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians invented this irrigation system themselves or borrowed the idea from even earlier cultures. But there's no question it's brilliant. Without irrigation, the desert would win and the barley would wither. You crouch by the canal and trail your fingers through the cool water. The silt is soft and slippery, leaving streaks on your skin, like chocolate pudding gone rogue. You stand and wipe your hands on your tunic, glancing around as a farmer calls to a donkey, pulling a low-wheeled cart nearby. The animal plods along, patiently carrying bundles of barley, tied in neat sheaves. The smell of the fresh grain is heady, nutty, grassy, and sweet all at once. You wander toward a shaded spot where a group of farmers is taking a break. They sit on low stools passing around a jar of beer. One of them offers you a sip. It's warm, a little sour, and it leaves tiny flecks of grain between your teeth, but after the heat of the fields, it's oddly refreshing. They laugh when you cough lightly at the unexpected tongue. It's the yeast, one man says. Or at least that's what you think he's saying. He mimics bubbles, rising with his fingers, and you nod in exaggerated agreement, which makes everyone laugh harder. A woman joins the group, balancing a basket of barley heads on her hip. She tells the others about the priest from the temple who came by earlier to bless the fields. Apparently, he sprinkled holy water from the Nile and muttered something about ensuring the grain grows tall enough to please the gods. Historians still argue whether these blessings actually influence farming success, or if they were just a way to make people feel like they had a little extra insurance. You suspect it's the latter, but you keep that thought to yourself. As the break ends, you help the farmers bundle stalks into neat sheaves. The barley rasp gently against your hands, leaving fine scratches that sting a little in the dry air. But there's something soothing about the repetitive motion-cut bundle tie. You imagine how many centuries of farmers have done exactly this their lives and livelihoods tied so closely to this humble plant. Nearby, a small shrine catches your eye. It's just a simple stone carved with faint hieroglyphs, placed at the edge of the field. A few wilted flowers and a cup of beer sit at its base. One farmer explains softly that it's an offering to Renenutet, the goddess of nourishment and harvest. You look closer at the carved figure, noting her cobra-like features, and feel a slight shiver. The Egyptians believed she watched over their crops, deciding who would prosper and who would starve. You silently hope she's in a good mood. As the afternoon deepens, the farmers finish their tasks. The barley destined for beer is carefully cut at just the right time, not too early and not too late. Too early and the grain will be weak. Too late and it may rot in the granaries. The harvested stalks are tied in bundles and stacked high onto donkey carts, ready to make the slow journey to storage. You follow the procession out of the fields, the dusty road leading back toward the cluster of granaries you glimpsed from afar earlier. The donkey's hooves beat a steady rhythm on the packed earth, and the carts creak softly under their loads. As the sun begins to dip toward the horizon, the golden glow of the barley fields takes on a deeper amber hue. You look back one last time, watching the wind ripple through the remaining stalks like waves on a golden sea. The path ahead narrows as you near the granaries. The air smells different now, heavier with dust and the faint musk of stored grain. You can hear the muffled voices of workers inside the storage compound, the sound of baskets being upended and kernels cascading like soft rain into massive mud brick silos. The granaries are waiting, and so is the next stage of this long, deliberate process. You step through the arched entrance of the granary complex, and the atmosphere shifts immediately. The sun's glare softens as you enter a shaded courtyard, surrounded by towering mud brick silos. The walls rise above you like fortress towers, their rough surfaces modeled with handprints from the builders who shaped them, layer by layer. The air here is still and heavy, laced with the dry, dusty scent of grain husks. A faint rustle echoes from within the silos, as if the barley itself is whispering in the dark. Workers move with quiet efficiency, barefoot on the packed earth floor. You watch as they hoist baskets of freshly harvested barley onto their shoulders, each basket wobbling precariously as they climb narrow wooden ladders to the tops of the silos. Once there, they tip the baskets forward, sending a golden stream of grain tumbling into the cavernous storage chambers below. The sound is hypnotic, like rain hitting a drum, but softer, muffled by layers of husk and dust. One of the older workers gestures for you to follow him. He leads you around the perimeter of the courtyard, stopping at a silo where a small group is sorting the barley before it's stored. They kneel in the dirt, pulling out any shriveled kernels, stones, or weeds that slipped through the harvest. The man picks up a cracked kernel and drops it into a separate basket, explaining with a shrug that damaged grain can spoil a whole batch. You nod, impressed by the precision. You've never thought of barley as delicate, but here it's treated like treasure. A gust of warm wind drifts in from the fields, lifting a swirl of dust into your face. You cough softly and wipe your eyes. The worker chuckles, patting you on the shoulder, and leads you inside one of the silos. It's cool and dim, a stark contrast to the bright courtyard outside. The only light filters through a narrow opening high above, casting a pale beam onto the floor. Your feet sink slightly into the soft layer of grain that already covers the ground. You reach down and scoop up a handful, feeling the kernels slide like tiny beads through your fingers. As you stand there, you imagine how important these silos are. One bad flood or one failed harvest, and the food supply could vanish. Beer bread and survival all depend on these towering stores of barley and emmer wheat. Historians still argue whether these granaries were state-controlled or run by temples, but either way, you can tell that access is tightly monitored. A stern-looking scribe sits nearby, reed pen poised over a scroll of papyrus, noting down exactly how much grain enters and leaves. He glances up at you with a look that says, "Don't even think about sneaking a handful," and you instinctively clasp your hands behind your back. A group of donkeys arrives, each laden with baskets of barley from more distant fields. Their handlers unload the grain, pausing now and then to sip from water jars. You notice how the workers seem to pace themselves, never rushing, even as the sun begins to dip lower. Life here isn't about speed. It's about maintaining a steady rhythm. The Nile gives, and the people follow its tempo. Nearby, a young boy helps his father pour a basket of barley into a measuring jar before it's added to storage. He struggles to balance the heavy container, and you can't help but step forward to steady it. He flashes you a shy smile, and his father murmurs a word of thanks. The boy points to a small shrine tucked in the corner of the granary, a simple clay figure of Renenutet, the harvest goddess dusted with flowery residue from the grain. The family bows their heads briefly in her direction, whispering a prayer that the stored barley will remain safe and plentiful until the next flood. You step back outside into the courtyard just as a gust of wind carries the faint scent of smoke and baking bread from the nearby village. It mingles with the aroma of grain and earth, making your stomach growl softly. Workers begin covering the silo entrances with reed mats, weighted down by heavy stones. These makeshift lids keep pests and moisture out, though you suspect the occasional mouse still finds its way in. You picture a tiny rodent slipping between the cracks and feasting like a king, and the image makes you smile. One of the overseers notices your amusement and raises an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by your daydream. He explains in a tone that's more lecture than conversation how carefully the silos must be maintained. A single outbreak of mold can ruin an entire store of barley. He gestures toward a corner where workers are smearing a fresh layer of mud over a cracked wall, sealing it against the elements. You nod gravely, making a mental note never to underestimate ancient Egyptian quality control. As evening draws near, the granary grows quieter. The last baskets of barley are delivered, and the workers gather their tools. Some head back toward the fields, others toward their homes in the village. A few remain behind to guard the silos overnight. You picture them sitting around a small fire, keeping watch against thieves and wild animals, telling stories to pass the long hours. The scribe closes his scroll, ties it with a strip of linen, and tucks it under his arm. He locks the granary gate with a wooden bar and gives you a final nod before departing. You glance up at the towering silos one last time. They stand like silent sentinels holding the future of the community in their cool, dark interiors. The path leading away from the granary slopes gently downward toward the heart of the village. From here, you can see smoke rising from the brewery you visited earlier. The warm, malty scent rides the evening breeze, inviting you back. But before you return, a soft clattering draws your attention. Just ahead, a group of women kneel beside a row of flat stone slabs, rhythmically grinding grain for tomorrow's batches. The steady scrape of stone on stone lulls you forward. You realize that what you're about to witness next, the transformation of barley from grain to flour, is the next vital step in this long, ancient process. And once again, you step closer, curious and oddly comforted by the endless rhythm of it all. You step toward the group of women grinding grain, drawn by the rhythmic scrape of stone against stone. The sound is almost hypnotic, blending with the distant hum of evening voices and the low cooing of pigeons roosting in the palm trees. As you approach, the warm scent of freshly milled flour fills the air, a nutty aroma that clings to your clothes and tickles your nose. You crouch beside one of the workers and watch closely. She kneels on a reed mat, her body swaying slightly forward and back as she works the top stone across the bottom slab. Each pass crushes barley kernels into finer and finer meal, the powder collecting in a shallow groove carved into the stone. Her hands are calloused, and fine lines of flour streak her forearms, making her look as though she's been dusted in chalk. She glances at you briefly and offers a tired smile before turning back to her work. You reach out to touch a small mound of meal that's already finished, and it's softer than you expect, almost silky. A nearby child, perhaps. Her daughter giggles as you rub it between your fingers, leaving ghostly streaks across your palms. "Flour beer," the girl says, pointing at your face, where a stray streak of powder has stuck to your chin. You grin, and the women laugh gently at your expense. The grinding stones themselves are simple, worn from years of use. Historians still argue whether this method was efficient or just tradition, but you can see how much effort it requires. The women lean forward with their full weight to crush the grain, shifting back and forth in a slow, deliberate rhythm. You can't help but wonder how many miles they travel each day, just with this motion alone. One woman pauses to stretch her aching back and gestures for you to try. You hesitate, then take her place on the mat. The top stone feels heavier than it looks, and when you push it forward, it barely moves. The women chuckle softly, offering encouragement in a mix of words and gestures. You lean harder and feel the stone finally scrape across the bottom slab, releasing a satisfying crunch of barley kernels breaking open. By the time you've completed 3 passes, your arms are burning and sweat beads on your forehead. You give up, bowing theatrically, and the women erupt in laughter. One pats your shoulder, another shoves a jug of water into your hands, and you're grateful for the cool drink. You sit back and watch again, more respectful now, of the strength and endurance it takes to keep the grain flowing. Without this steady labor, there would be no flour for bread and no mash for beer. The connection between these quiet workers and the bustling brewery becomes crystal clear. A man with a shaved head and a reed pen tucked behind his ear appears, carrying a small basket of barley. He examines the quality of the flour nods approvingly and makes a quick note on a scrap of papyrus. You suspect he's another scribe keeping track of every kernel, just as his colleague at the granary did. He catches your curious look and explains with a faint smile that poorly milled flour can ruin a batch of beer. Too coarse and it won't soak properly. Too fine and it turns gummy. You nod as though you understand completely, though you're mostly just impressed by how precise this process is. As the women finish grinding for the day, they gather up the flour and pour it carefully into baskets lined with linen. One of the older women murmurs a quick blessing over the baskets, asking the gods to protect the grain from pests. You remember the shrine at the granary, and wonder whether the same goddess, Renenutet, is listening here too. The baskets are carried to a shaded area near the brewery where they'll be stored until needed. You trail behind, brushing flour off your tunic as you go. The brewery compound is quieter now, the shadows longer, but the sweet malty smell in the air is stronger than ever. Inside, you find several brewers preparing vats for the next stage. You watch as they pour water into the large ceramic tubs, the surface shimmering in the golden light. The sound is soothing, like a small stream filling a pond. A young apprentice adds a handful of dried dates to the water, their sticky sweetness dissolving slowly. He explains that the dates will give the beer a richer flavor and help feed the yeast later. Another brewer tosses in a pinch of spices coriander and maybe something you can't quite identify. You catch yourself inhaling deeply, enjoying the strange mix of scents. As you move closer, you notice a group of brewers tending to sprouted grains spread out on woven mats. They stir the piles gently, making sure the tiny green shoots don't tangle together. This is the malting process the brewer tells you, though. He uses a word you don't recognize. He explains that letting the grain sprout unlocks the natural sugars needed for fermentation. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians discovered malting by accident or through careful observation, but either way, it's a clever trick. You reach out to touch a sprouted barley stalk, and it's warm from the sun. The brewer nods approvingly, then points to a batch that's gone too far. It sprouts long and tangled. That grain will be fed to animals, he says, because it's no good for beer now. You imagine how devastating it must be to lose a batch after so much effort, and the thought makes you feel oddly protective of the tiny sprouts in front of you. As dusk settles, the brewers gather the sprouted grain and begin grinding it into coarse meal, ready for mashing. The rhythmic scrape of stone querns starts again echoing the sound you heard earlier in the village. It's a reminder that every step in this process connects back to the beginning. A soft breeze blows through the open courtyard carrying the scent of the Nile and the faint hum of insects. You find yourself leaning against a warm mud brick wall, content just to watch the slow dance of preparation. The brewers move with the same steady rhythm as the farmers and the millers before them, each action a quiet step in a centuries-old tradition. Soon, the vats will be filled with malted grain, and the mash will be sweetened with dates and spices. But for now, you allow yourself to linger in the moment, savoring the simple comfort of knowing exactly where the story is headed next. You wake the next morning to the soft hum of the brewery, already alive with activity. The early light seeps over the mud brick walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The air carries a sweet, earthy aroma, thicker now than before, and you realize the brewers have begun soaking the grain in preparation for malting. You step closer to the ground, cool under your bare feet, and watch the quiet dance unfold. Rows of large woven baskets brimming with barley are lowered carefully into shallow pools of river water dug into the ground. A young brewer, no older than 17, gestures for you to crouch down beside him. He plunges his hands into the water and stirs the grain, slowly making sure each kernel is fully submerged. You copy him, and the water feels surprisingly cold, a refreshing break from the gathering heat of the morning. He grins and shows you how to gently agitate the grain so it doesn't clump together. You notice that the pools themselves are lined with clay to keep the water from leaking away. The brewer explains that this step, the soaking, will coax the barley to sprout. The soaked kernels will soon burst into tiny green shoots, which will unlock the sugars needed for brewing. You nod, marveling at the patience this requires. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians stumbled upon this method by accident, or if they intentionally discovered that sprouted grain made better beer. Either way, it feels like alchemy. A few older brewers wander through the courtyard checking the baskets with practiced hands. One mutters something about the importance of timing, pointing to a batch that has already been soaking overnight. Too short a soak, and the grain won't sprout properly. Too long, and it will rot. You glance at the baskets and wonder how they keep track of so many at once. The brewer shrugs when you ask, as if to say, "We just know." You're drawn to a shaded corner where a batch of grain has already begun sprouting. The shoots are barely a centimeter long, delicate and pale green. A woman kneels nearby, turning the grain carefully so it dries evenly. She motions for you to feel the warmth. You run your fingers through the sprouting kernels, and it's like touching sun-warmed sand. The woman explains that this warmth is natural, the barley generating its own heat as it grows. You're surprised to learn that if they don't stir, the heat could actually kill the grain. A small boy carrying a basket of fresh river reeds toddles past, and you can't help but smile at his tiny contribution. He drops the reeds in a neat pile near the sprouting grain, and you watch as the brewers weave them into thin mats. These mats are used to spread the barley out so it can dry after soaking. It's a clever system, one that clearly evolved over countless generations. You wander back toward the vats and pause at a group of brewers gathered in a circle. One is telling a story, his voice rising and falling dramatically as the others laugh. You catch bits about a crocodile stealing someone's lunch and an unlucky fisherman who had to chase it downstream. You chuckle along, even though you don't catch every word. It's a reminder that while brewing is work, it's also a social ritual. These people spend long days together, their lives intertwined like the reeds they weave for drying mats. Nearby, an older woman pulls you aside to show you a batch of malted grain that's ready for the next stage. She bites into a kernel and chews thoughtfully before handing one to you. You hesitate but follow suit. The sprouted grain is sweet, much sweeter than raw barley. She nods, clearly satisfied, and dumps the basket into a large ceramic tub. Water from the Nile is poured in, followed by a thick stream of date syrup. You watch as the syrup coils like molten amber before dissolving in the water. The brewers stir the mixture with long wooden paddles, their arms moving in slow unison. The sound of wood scraping the sides of the tub is steady, almost soothing. One man adds a pinch of coriander, another tosses in a handful of something you think might be chamomile. You recognize the pattern now. Every addition is deliberate, each ingredient layered carefully like notes in a song. You crouch beside one of the vats and peer into the mash. The surface ripples gently as the paddles move through it, releasing a warm, sweet smell that clings to your hair and clothes. You close your eyes and imagine how many countless batches have been made this way, generation after generation, each brewer adding a personal touch to the same ancient recipe. A sudden shout draws your attention to a sprouting area. One batch has gone too far, the shoots long and tangled. The brewers groan in disappointment, knowing this grain can't be used. You feel a pang of sympathy as they scoop it into a basket for animal feed. The loss is minor, they assure you, but you can tell they take it seriously. Each handful of grain represents hours of labor, and wasting any of it stings. You wander back toward the vats, your footsteps slow as the brewers continue to stir. The courtyard has settled into a quiet rhythm. Again, each person focused on their task. Even the animals seem calmer, the donkeys standing in the shade with half-closed eyes, tails lazily swishing at flies. As the sun climbs higher, the brewers begin to cover the vats with thick linen cloths. This is the moment when nature must do its work. The mash will rest, and the hidden magic will begin fermentation. But that's a step for later. For now, you simply watch as the last basket of malt is tipped into the final vat, the barley landing with a soft splash. The brewers step back, satisfied, and you know it's time to follow the process forward. You glance once more at the sprouted grains drying on their reed mats, the basket soaking in the pools, and the carefully stirred vats. Every stage feels like a delicate balance of timing and intuition. And as you take a step toward the covered vats, you realize the next step, the mysterious, bubbling life of fermentation, is about to begin. The brewery is hushed now, the sounds of activity, reduced to the soft creak of wood and the occasional murmur of voices. You step closer to the line of large ceramic vats, the linen covers fluttering faintly in the afternoon breeze. The air has changed. It's heavier, warmer, and carries a tangy sweetness that clings to the back of your throat. The brewer's work is mostly done for the moment, but you can feel the anticipation lingering. This is where things become less predictable, where the unseen magic of brewing begins. A brewer removes one of the linen covers and gestures for you to peer inside. The mash, which looked so still and lifeless before, is now alive with tiny bubbles breaking the surface. It's faint but unmistakable, the first signs of fermentation. The brewer dips a ladle into the warm liquid and brings it close to your nose. The smell is rich, almost fruity, with a faint sour edge. You imagine yeast, though you know the Egyptians wouldn't have called it that. Historians still argue whether they understood the process at all, or simply chalked it up to divine intervention. Osiris, the brewer, whispers, patting the side of the vat gently, as though the god himself is sleeping inside. You nod solemnly, aware that this mixture is now sacred in its own way. The Egyptians believed beer was a gift from the gods, especially Osiris, who was said to have taught humanity how to cultivate grain. You glance at the bubbling surface again, half expecting to see a divine figure rising from the foam. Another brewer approaches with a bundle of dates and drops them into the vat, stirring slowly with a long wooden paddle. The dates dissolve, adding extra sugars for the fermentation to feed on. He explains in a low voice that the more the yeast eats, the stronger and more flavorful the beer becomes. You watch the paddle swirl through the mixture, creating eddies and ripples that glint in the dim light. As you walk past the vats, you notice how each brewer treats the process differently. One hums softly as he stirs, another taps the rim of the vat in a particular pattern, almost like a ritual. You suspect these habits are part superstition, part tradition. Brewing, after all, isn't always reliable. The air temperature, the quality of the grain, even the mood of the gods, any of it could alter the outcome. A young apprentice leans in to whisper, his eyes darting around to make sure no overseers are listening. He confesses that some brewers sneak wild honey into their vats, believing it makes the beer taste richer. Others insist honey spoils the batch. He shrugs, unsure which is true, but promises to let you taste both versions later. If you stick around, you grin, intrigued. You move toward the back of the courtyard where the vats ferment in the shade. The air here is warmer, thick with the smell of yeast. You spot one brewer crouched close to his vat, his ear pressed against the clay, as though he's listening to the beer breathe. When he catches your curious look, he explains that the sound of bubbles rising too fast can mean trouble. You listen for yourself, pressing your ear to the vat's surface, and hear a faint fizzing like distant rain. It's oddly calming. A sudden commotion distracts you. One vat is frothing violently, foam spilling over the rim. The brewers rush to contain it, scooping away the excess with woven baskets. Someone mutters about the gods being impatient, and another brewer jokes that the yeast just had too much date syrup. You're relieved when the foam subsides, leaving the beer still bubbling steadily beneath. As the afternoon drifts toward evening, the brewers gather around a fire in the center of the courtyard. They talk in low voices about how the beer will taste this time. One mentions adding herbs from the temple gardens, maybe thyme or juniper to please the priests. Another suggests more coriander, though his colleague rolls his eyes. You realize that even in ancient Egypt, people could debate recipes for hours. The fire crackles softly as you settle nearby, the warmth easing the chill creeping in with the night air. Someone hands you a small clay cup filled with an earlier batch of beer. It's cloudy and warm with a tangy sweetness that surprises you. You take a slow sip, letting the flavor settle on your tongue. It's rougher than modern beer, a little gritty, but it's oddly comforting. You glance up to find the brewers watching you expectantly, and you give them an approving nod. They smile, pleased with your reaction. One of the older brewers leans closer and tells you about the temple priests who rely on beer, not just for daily sustenance, but for religious rituals. Beer is poured as offerings to the gods, used to seal deals between nobles, and even offered to the dead. He points to the sky now streaked with stars, and says that those buried with beer will never go thirsty in the afterlife. You shiver slightly at the thought and sip from your cup, again, suddenly more grateful for its humble contents. As the fire dies down, the brewers rise to check the vats one last time. The bubbling continues steadily, and they replace the linen covers with care. The courtyard is almost silent now, except for the occasional pop of fermentation. You realize you've been standing in the same spot for what feels like hours, lulled by the rhythm of it all. The head brewer claps you lightly on the shoulder and gestures toward a smaller structure near the edge of the compound. This, he explains, is where the next step will take place. The beer will be strained and clarified, transformed from its current cloudy state into the smooth golden drink you've come to appreciate. You follow him through the shadows, feeling the cool night air settle on your skin, eager to see how this final act of refinement unfolds. You follow the head brewer through the darkened courtyard, your bare feet brushing against the cool, packed earth. The smell of fermenting beer lingers behind you, rich and sweet, but the air ahead is fresher, tinged with the scent of river reeds. You arrive at a smaller structure near the edge of the compound, lit only by the soft glow of oil lamps. This is where the beer will be strained, clarified, and made ready to drink. Inside, woven reed mats hang from the rafters, casting long shadows on the walls. A row of clay jars sits waiting on a low wooden platform. You can hear faint splashing as a group of brewers works carefully over a large vat of beer, scooping the cloudy liquid into baskets lined with finely woven fibers. They nod to you as you step closer, but they don't pause their work. Their hands move with practiced efficiency, straining the mixture to separate the grain solids from the liquid. You lean in to watch as the beer passes through the basket's fibers. It emerges in a smooth stream, pale and golden, filling the waiting jars below. The air is warm and damp, and the smell of malt and yeast seems sharper in this enclosed space. One brewer explains that this step is essential, otherwise the drink would be thick and gritty with leftover grain. You nod, remembering the earlier sip you'd taken that left bits of barley stuck between your teeth. Another brewer invites you to try your hand at straining. You grip the basket carefully as he tips a ladle of frothy beer into it. The basket is heavier than you expected, and the warm liquid seeps through, slowly pooling in the jar beneath. When you lift the basket, you're surprised by the sticky mash of grain husks left behind. The brewer gestures toward a pile in the corner where the spent grain is dumped. Later, he says it will be used as animal feed or fertilizer. Nothing is wasted. A younger apprentice approaches with a bundle of reeds and begins trimming them into fine strips. He explains that these strips are sometimes used to line the baskets, creating an even finer filter. You watch him work, marveling at how even the simplest materials, reeds baskets, clay jars, are used with such care. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians understood how much this extra straining improved flavor, or if they just did it out of habit. Either way, the results speak for themselves. As the jars fill, another brewer seals them with flat discs of clay, pressing them firmly into place. Each seal is marked with a stamp bearing the brewery's emblem. You study one closely and see a series of neat hieroglyphs, a stylized barley stalk, the name of the head brewer, and a date. It's a system of accountability, he explains. If a batch turns out poorly, the mark shows exactly who made it. You try not to imagine the awkward conversation that would follow a spoiled batch. A small group of women enters carrying trays of dried herbs and spices. They stir the additions gently into some of the jars, coriander in one, chamomile in another. The head brewer leans close to tell you that these flavored beers are popular with the temples and wealthier households. The common people usually drink the plain version, but even they enjoy the occasional spice batch. You take a mental note to ask for one of the chamomile-infused jars later. You notice a jar with a crack running down its side, and you point it out to the brewer. He grimaces and explains that cracked jars can ruin the beer by letting in air and pests. One of the apprentices quickly replaces it with a new jar, while another pours the beer back through the filter just to be safe. It's a reminder of how fragile the process can be. Once the straining is complete, the brewers carry the sealed jars into a cool storage room dug into the earth. The room is dark and damp, a welcome relief from the heat outside. You run your fingers along the smooth clay jars as they're stacked in neat rows. Some are destined for temples, others for noble households, and many for the daily rations of workers. Each jar, you realize, carries a little piece of the Nile's lifeblood. As the last jar is placed on its shelf, the brewers let out a collective sigh. The hardest part is over. They gather around a low table and pass around a cup of freshly strained beer. One of them raises it in a mock toast to the gods, and the others laugh softly. You take a sip when it's offered, and you notice the difference immediately. The beer is smoother now, less gritty, with a subtle sweetness from the dates. A debate breaks out among the brewers about whether the beer tastes better after a few days in storage. Some swear it improves, others insist it's best fresh. Historians still argue the same point today, but you're too drowsy to care. You cradle the clay cup in your hands, savoring the last sip before it's passed to the next person. The head brewer claps you gently on the shoulder and points toward the doorway. Beyond it, you can see the soft glow of lanterns in the village. Workers are gathering for the evening meal, and you can hear the faint hum of conversation and laughter. He explains that it's time to distribute the jar's beer for the workers, for the temples, for the households that rely on it every day. You step outside into the cool night air, following the brewers as they carry jars of beer toward the waiting crowd. You can't help but notice how everyone's eyes brighten at the sight of the jars, how the simple drink seems to tie the entire community together, and as you walk with them, you begin to understand just how deeply beer is woven into the fabric of life along the Nile. The village is alive with quiet anticipation as the brewers step into the lantern-lit square, each carrying sealed jars of the freshly strained beer. You follow, close behind, watching as the crowd of workers, servants, and families gathers with patient curiosity. The soft murmur of voices fills the air, punctuated by the occasional bray of a donkey or the distant splash of the Nile lapping against its banks. The jars are set down in a neat row at the center of the square. A scribe steps forward with a scroll of papyrus, carefully unrolling it and checking off names. You notice how precise he is, pausing after each mark to glance at the stamped seals on the jars. Beer distribution isn't casual here. It's as organized as any modern payroll. One by one, workers approach to collect their ration. They bow their heads slightly in thanks before carrying the heavy jars home. You watch as the first man cracks open the clay seal of his jar, releasing a faint hiss of trapped air. The smell is unmistakable, sweet malty with a tang of yeast. He pours a generous cup for his wife, who accepts it with a tired smile. Their young son peers over her shoulder, begging for a sip, and she shushes him gently, reminding him that his time will come when he's older. You can't help but chuckle softly. Some things never change. As more jars are distributed, the crowd begins to relax. Small groups settle on woven mats, sipping their beer and sharing bowls of bread and lentil stew. You take a seat on the edge of one circle, welcomed with nods and quiet smiles. Someone passes you a cup, and you accept it gratefully. The beer is warm and a little tart, but it's refreshing after the long day. You sip slowly, letting the flavors settle on your tongue. One man leans close to tell you how the beer helps them stay nourished while working in the fields. It's not just a drink, he explains, but a vital part of their diet. The beer is thick with nutrients from the barley, and emmer wheat and its low alcohol content makes it safe for children in small amounts. You nod, understanding now why the jars are so valued. Nearby, a young woman offers you a piece of bread dipped in beer. The bread is dense and chewy, and the beer softens it just enough to make it pleasant to eat. You thank her, and she laughs softly, telling you that this combination is a favorite among workers. Historians still argue whether beer or bread came first in Egypt, but tasting them together, you suspect they were always meant to coexist. As the meal continues, you overhear conversations about the upcoming Harvest Temple festivals, and even a few whispered rumors about the Pharaohs' latest project upriver. The beer seems to loosen tongues and soften the edges of daily worries. You can see why it's more than just sustenance. It's a bond, a social glue that connects everyone from the humblest worker to the most powerful noble. A small group of musicians arrives carrying lyres and flutes. They begin to play a soft melody that drifts over the square like a warm breeze. Children gather near the musicians, clapping their hands and dancing awkwardly in the flickering lantern light. Their laughter mingles with the music filling the night with a gentle joy. You lean back against a wooden post, cradling your cup of beer, and let the sounds wash over you. You notice an elderly woman sitting near the edge of the gathering, sipping slowly from a small jar. She catches your eye and beckons you closer. Her voice is raspy but warm, as she tells you stories about how beer has been part of life here for as long as she can remember. She recalls how her grandmother used to bless each jar before drinking, whispering prayers to the gods for good health and protection. You ask if she still does it, and she smiles. Every time she says, lifting her cup skyward before taking another sip. A child tugs at your sleeve, eager to show you something. He leads you to a small shrine tucked in a corner of the square. The flickering light of an oil lamp reveals offerings left for Hathor, the goddess of joy and music, who is often associated with beer. Someone has poured a small libation into a shallow bowl at the base of the shrine. You watch as the boy imitates the gesture, pretending to pour his own imaginary cup. The night deepens, and the distribution slowly winds down. The scribe rolls up his papyrus scroll, satisfied that everyone has received their share. The remaining jars are set aside for temples and palace officials, who will collect them in the morning. You stand and stretch, feeling the warmth of the beer settle comfortably in your belly. As the villagers begin to drift home, you notice the brewers exchanging quiet words. One mentions the next batch already soaking in the vats, while another talks about preparing the temple offerings. You realize there's no real end to the cycle. The work of brewing and sharing beer is as constant as the flow of the Nile itself. You glance up at the star-filled sky, wondering how many generations have looked at the same constellations while sharing a simple drink like this. And as you follow the last of the crowd back toward the brewery, you feel the rhythm of life in ancient Egypt settling over you like a soft, warm blanket. The next morning dawns bright and warm, the sunlight painting the mud brick walls of the brewery in shades of honey and amber. You return to the compound just as the brewers are gathering around the rows of sealed jars. Today is a day of careful labeling and storage, a step as vital as any in the process. Without proper sealing and tracking, the precious beer could spoil or vanish into the wrong hands. You watch as the brewers lift the heavy jars, one by one, onto a low stone platform. The head brewer examines each clay seal, tapping it lightly with a wooden mallet to check for cracks. Any jar that fails the test is set aside to be resealed or consumed immediately. One young apprentice drops a jar by mistake, and the sound of shattering clay sends everyone into a tense silence. Warm beer spreads across the courtyard floor, and the apprentice looks ready to melt into the ground. But instead of anger, the head brewer sighs and pats the boy's shoulder, reminding him that mistakes are part of learning. You can almost see the boy's shoulders relax in relief. A scribe stands nearby with a long scroll of papyrus reed pen, scratching steadily as he records the jars. You peek over his shoulder and recognize the careful hieroglyphs you saw earlier. The brewer's name, the date, and often a note about the beer's intended recipient. This jar for the workers at the granary, that jar for the temple priests, another for the noble household upriver. The system is meticulous, and you can't help but admire how organized it all is. Historians still argue whether this level of record-keeping was driven by the Pharaohs' government or by the temples. But you can tell it's deeply ingrained in daily life. One jar catches your eye. Its seal is marked with a symbol of a falcon, the emblem of the royal household. The head brewer notices your curiosity and explains in a hushed tone that this batch will be delivered to the Pharaoh's palace itself. You imagine the beer making its way through bustling palace corridors, perhaps served at grand banquets where nobles recline on cushioned couches. It's strange to think that the same drink nourishing farmers in the fields will soon be sipped by the most powerful man in Egypt. The brewers move the sealed jars into a cool storage room built partly underground. The room is dark and damp, a stark contrast to the blazing sunlight outside. You step inside carefully, your feet echoing softly on the clay floor. Rows of jars stretch into the shadows, stacked neatly like silent sentinels. The air smells faintly of earth and fermenting grain, a scent that feels oddly comforting now. As you explore the storage room, the head brewer explains that beer can spoil if stored incorrectly. The jars must be kept away from direct sunlight and protected from pests. He shows you how they check the seals, periodically listening for a faint hiss of gas that could indicate a leak. You nod, impressed by the quiet precision of it all. A young brewer appears with a small pot of fresh clay and begins resealing any jars that look questionable. You watch as he presses the clay disc firmly into place and smooths the edges with his fingers. Once sealed, he stamps the surface, with the brewery's emblem ensuring that everyone will know where this jar came from. He tells you that forged seals are rare, but not unheard of. Beer is valuable enough to tempt thieves. The head brewer hands you a small cup of beer, drawn from a newly sealed jar. You take a careful sip, savoring the smooth, sweet flavor. It's much clearer than the beer you tasted before, and you can't help but appreciate how far it has come from those first handfuls of grain. As you finish your drink, the brewers begin loading jars onto wooden sledges. These will be dragged by donkeys to the nearby temples, households, and work sites. You're surprised by how heavy the jars are. Even the smallest ones require 2 people to lift. One brewer jokes that carrying beer is as much a workout as drinking it is a reward. Outside, you watch as a scribe oversees the loading process, checking each jar against his list. He argues briefly with a brewer about a missing batch, and they both disappear into the storage room to investigate. You suspect the jar will turn up soon. Misplacing beer is not something these people take lightly. Once the sledges are fully loaded, the donkeys are led forward, their hooves clopping softly on the packed earth. You walk alongside the caravan as it leaves the brewery, the line of jars swaying gently with each step. The path leads you past the village square, where children pause their games to wave at the brewers. One boy calls out, asking if any of the beer will be left over for the festival next week. The brewers laugh and promise that there will be. As the caravan reaches the riverbank, you see a group of boatmen waiting with broad wooden barges. The jars are carefully transferred onto the boats, where they're packed tightly with bundles of reeds to keep them from breaking during the journey. The boatmen work quickly, accustomed to the routine, and soon the barges are ready to set sail. The head brewer gestures for you to climb aboard one of the boats. You step carefully onto the deck, feeling it shift slightly beneath your feet. The river glitters in the sunlight, and a soft breeze carries the scent of papyrus and distant flowers. You realize that this next stage, the distribution of beer along the Nile, will take you deeper into Egypt's world, connecting distant temples, households, and communities. The boatman unties the rope from the dock and pushes off with a long pole. The barge drifts smoothly into the river's current, the jars clinking softly in the hold below. As the village recedes behind you, you feel the familiar rhythm of life along the Nile carry you forward once again. The barge glides gently down the Nile, its wooden hull creaking softly with each ripple of water. You settle onto a bundle of reeds near the stern, the warm breeze brushing against your face as you watch the scenery shift slowly past. On either side of the river, lush green fields stretch toward the horizon, a stark contrast to the pale desert beyond. Life in Egypt clings to the river's edge, like a necklace of emeralds, and it's easy to see why beer, the drink made from this land's grain, touches every life here. As the boatman pulls the barge forward, you peer into the hold, where the jars of beer are stacked neatly in rows. Each one is marked with its destination, temples, granaries, noble estates, and work sites. You ask the head brewer, sitting beside you, how many jars will be delivered today. He shrugs and says it depends on the needs of the community, though the temples always receive their share first. Beer isn't just sustenance. He reminds you it's a sacred offering. A fellow passenger, a middle-aged man with sun-browned skin and a wide grin, leans over to tell you how beer rationing works. Every laborer receives a daily allowance, enough to drink with meals, to stay hydrated while working, and to share with family at the end of the day. He laughs as he explains that some workers even trade portions of their ration for favors or goods, though it's not exactly encouraged. You picture someone bargaining for a better tool or extra bread in exchange for a cup of beer and can't help but smile. The boat drifts past a group of farmers tending fields of barley. They wave as they spot the barge and call out to the boatmen, asking when the next batch of beer will arrive. One of the brewers shouts back that it's coming soon, and the farmers cheer, clearly encouraged by the news. You realize just how essential beer is, not only for nutrition, but also for morale. It's a daily reminder of the community's effort, the reward for their labor. As you approach a small riverside village, the boatman expertly maneuvers the barge toward the dock. Children run to greet the vessel, their feet kicking up dust as they shout excitedly. The villagers gather quickly, knowing the boat carries the jars of beer they've been waiting for. The scribe steps forward with his scroll of papyrus, calling out names as the jars are unloaded one by one. You help carry a jar to a young mother who balances it carefully on her hip. She thanks you with a tired but genuine smile, explaining that the beer will feed her family for the next several days. It's not just a drink, she says, but a staple rich in calories and safer than water drawn from the river. You glance at the Nile and can't help but think of the crocodiles and the occasional sewage drifting downstream. Yes, you think beer is definitely the safer option. As the distribution continues, you notice one jar being set aside for the temple. It's marked with a symbol of the goddess Hathor, and you remember the shrine you saw in the village square. This beer, you're told, will be poured as an offering during the next festival. The priest himself will bless it before it's shared with the community. You watch as the jar is loaded onto a small cart, feeling the deep connection between this simple drink and the spiritual life of the people. When the boat is empty, the villagers wave goodbye, clutching their jars tightly as though they're holding treasure. The boatmen push off from the dock and continue downstream. You relax into the rhythm of the river again, lulled by the soft slap of water against the hull. A fellow passenger, a wiry man with calloused hands, leans over and tells you stories of how beer rations once fueled great building projects, the pyramids, the temples, the grand tombs of the Pharaohs. He says workers received beer 3 times a day, and you can imagine how it must have sustained them through grueling labor. Historians still argue whether this was a fair payment or simply a clever way to keep workers dependent, but you can see how important beer was to the entire system. The barge makes one final stop at a bustling construction site. Dozens of laborers swarm the docks, their muscular bodies glistening with sweat. They work tirelessly moving massive stone blocks, and when they see the beer arrive, their faces brighten. The jars are carried off the barge and into the work camp, where they'll be divided among the workers. You notice how even here, in the heat and dust, the distribution follows the same careful process. Seals check names, called portions, counted. As the sun begins to dip toward the horizon, casting the Nile in shades of gold and crimson, the boat turns back toward the brewery. The empty hold creaks softly, and the brewers begin talking about the next batches that will soon be ready. You realize the cycle never stops. The fields must be tended because the grain stored the mash, fermented the beer, distributed over and over again, as steady and constant as the river itself. You lean against the side of the barge, watching the distant lights of the village flicker in the growing darkness. The jars of beer you helped deliver are already being opened, shared, and celebrated. Tomorrow it will happen all over again. And as the current carries you closer to the heart of the community, you begin to understand why beer is more than just sustenance. Here, it's the thread that ties everyone along the Nile together. By the time you return to the brewery, the sky is awash with deep purples and soft streaks of orange. The air is cooler now, but the faint scent of malt and yeast still lingers around the compound like a ghost of the day's labor. You step through the open gates and notice the brewers already unloading grain for the next batch, the cycle beginning again without pause. Yet tonight your path takes you in a different direction toward the temples and the afterlife, where beer plays a role as sacred as it does practical. One of the brewers, an older man with lines etched deep into his face, motions for you to follow. He carries a jar marked with the symbol of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. You trail behind him through narrow streets, past clusters of mud brick houses where families sit sharing their evening meals. Eventually, the winding path opens onto a temple complex illuminated by flickering oil lamps. The temple's stone walls rise high above you, etched with hieroglyphs that seem to dance in the shifting light. Priests in linen robes glide silently between columns, their heads shaved and their expressions solemn. You feel a hush settle over you as you approach the entrance, the air thick with the scent of burning incense. Inside the temple, the head priest accepts the jar of beer with a quiet nod. He explains in a voice barely above a whisper that the beer will be poured as an offering to the gods during the night's rituals. You watch as he carries it to the altar, setting it down beside loaves of bread, fresh flowers, and small bronze figurines. The priest lifts his arms, chanting softly in a language that feels ancient, even in this ancient place. Historians still argue how much the Egyptians truly believed the gods consumed these offerings, or if they were symbolic, but the reverence is undeniable. The priest dips a ladle into the jar and pours a small amount onto the ground, murmuring a blessing. The remaining beer will be shared among the temple attendants later, but for now it is sacred, a bridge between the mortal and the divine. You leave the temple in awe, the sound of chanting fading behind you, as you follow the brewer toward the edge of the city. There beyond the last rows of houses lies a necropolis, dotted with tombs of every size. The night air is cooler out here, and the only light comes from the stars above, and the lantern the brewer carries. He explains that beer isn't only offered to the gods, it's also placed in the tombs of the dead to nourish them on their eternal journey. You stop at a modest grave where a family is gathered. They kneel by a freshly sealed tomb, whispering prayers as they arrange small jars of beer, loaves of bread, and simple trinkets near the entrance. One woman, her face streaked with tears, lifts a cup of beer and holds it out to the tomb as though offering it directly to the departed. You can feel the love in the gesture, and it stirs something deep in your chest. Nearby, you notice larger tombs, monuments built for nobles and officials. Their burial chambers are stocked with far more lavish supplies, fine linens, expensive jewelry, and rows upon rows of beer jars. You wonder if the dead truly need so much in the afterlife, or if the living simply can't bear the thought of sending them off with too little. A priest who has been watching you approaches and tells you a story about the pharaohs who were buried with vast cellars of beer. Some believed that in the afterlife they would host banquets for the gods themselves. The priest's voice is soft but firm as he adds, "To deny beer to the dead would be to deny them comfort." You nod solemnly, realizing just how deeply beer is woven into every aspect of Egyptian existence. The brewer leads you deeper into the necropolis where the air grows stiller and the stars brighter. You pass tombs adorned with painted murals depicting scenes of harvest and feasting. In one, you notice a brewer bent over a vat, his hands stirring the mash. You smile at the thought that even in death, the craft of beer making is celebrated. At the edge of the cemetery, the brewer stops and places the last jar of beer at the entrance of an unmarked tomb. He bows his head for a moment of silent respect before turning back toward the city. You follow in silence, your footsteps soft against the sandy ground. As you re-enter the village, you can hear faint music from the square, the same melody you heard the night before. Families sit outside their homes, talking and laughing as they share their evening meal. Some drink from cups of beer, others pour a small sip onto the earth before taking their first taste, a gesture of gratitude and remembrance. You settle near a fire at the edge of the square and cradle a cup of beer in your hands. The warmth of the drink seeps into you as you think about all you've seen, the temples, the tombs, the offerings made to gods and ancestors alike. Beer is not just sustenance here. It is memory, faith, and connection. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the river. You realize that in Egypt, beer flows through every part of life, from the barley fields to the breweries, from the bustling villages to the silent tombs. It is a thread that ties the living and the dead together, binding them all to the rhythm of the Nile. The following day, you wake to a soft chorus of morning sounds, the cooing of doves in the palm trees, the distant bray of donkeys, and the gentle lap of the Nile against the shore. The brewery is already alive with activity, but instead of heading toward the vats and sprouted grain, the head brewer waves you in another direction. Today, you're invited to see the Royal Breweries, a place few commoners ever glimpse. You follow him along a well-worn path that leads beyond the bustling village and into the outskirts of a sprawling palace complex. The sun reflects off the whitewashed walls, almost too bright to look at directly. Guards stand at the entrance, spears glinting, and you can't help but feel a flicker of unease. But the brewer explains that the Pharaoh's court needs beer as much as anyone else, perhaps more. Inside the gates, the royal brewery is larger and more ornate than the village one. Tall columns line the courtyard, their surfaces painted with scenes of harvests and banquets. The vats are bigger, too, some taller than you are, and the workers wear clean linen garments that mark their elevated status. You notice how quietly they move, aware that any mistake here might carry severe consequences. One brewer beckons you closer to watch, as he stirs a vat with a paddle as tall as a tree. He explains that these royal batches are brewed with richer ingredients, more dates for sweetness, more barley for strength, and sometimes exotic spices brought in from distant lands. You catch the faint scent of cinnamon and cardamom as he lifts the paddle droplets of warm mash, clinging to the wood. A scribe shows you the stamped seals on the royal jars. Unlike the simple markings in the village, these seals are intricate, bearing the pharaoh's emblem and elaborate hieroglyphs. He tells you that each jar is catalogued, carefully destined for royal banquets, religious festivals, or as gifts to foreign dignitaries. Beer from these vats, he says with a hint of pride, represents the pharaoh himself. You're led into a shaded chamber where brewers are experimenting with new recipes. One is sprinkling dried figs into the mash, another crushing fragrant herbs into a fine powder. You sample a spoonful of one batch at the brewer's insistence, and the flavor is surprisingly complex, sweet, spicy, and slightly bitter. He grins when you nod appreciatively and tells you that only the best brewers are chosen for the palace where innovation is encouraged to impress the royal court. Historians still argue whether these experimental beers ever made it to the common people or if they were reserved exclusively for the elite. Looking around at the gleaming vats and carefully measured ingredients, you suspect most never left the palace walls. Your guide points out a row of jars marked for the temple of Amun, the god most closely tied to the pharaoh's power. These jars will be carried in processions during upcoming festivals, their contents poured as offerings before the gods. You imagine the spectacle: priests chanting incense filling the air and the beer flowing like a golden river onto sacred altars. As you walk deeper into the brewery, you come across a storeroom where the jars are stacked in towering rows. A guard stands watch at the entrance, his eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. The brewer explains that theft from the royal brewery is considered a grave crime punishable by harsh penalties. You shiver slightly at the thought and decide not to linger near the storeroom for too long. Beyond the storeroom, a shaded veranda overlooks the palace gardens. You pause to take in the view, lush green trees, ponds teeming with fish, and carefully tended flower beds. Servants carry trays of food and drink to the palace kitchens, and you spot more than a few jars of beer among them. You realize that beer isn't just sustenance here, it's a symbol of abundance, a marker of prestige and hospitality. You're invited to join a small tasting for the palace officials. The beer is served in elegant cups made of glazed pottery, and its aroma is stronger than anything you've tried before. One official lifts his cup and declares it fit for the pharaoh himself, though you suspect he would have said the same no matter what. You sip slowly, savoring the layers of flavor. This beer is richer, sweeter, and more intoxicating than the village variety. As the tasting winds down, a royal messenger arrives with a sealed tablet. He delivers it to the head brewer, who reads it carefully before announcing that a special batch must be prepared for an upcoming royal wedding. You watch as the brewers spring into action, gathering the finest ingredients and discussing how to make the beer worthy of the celebration. The head brewer turns to you and explains that these special batches will be remembered long after the event. Some will even be buried in the tombs of the newlyweds, ensuring their journey into the afterlife is as comfortable as their life in the palace. You think back to the jars you saw in the necropolis, and understand now that beer is as important to the elite in death as it is in life. You leave the royal brewery as the sun begins to dip, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The guards nod politely as you pass through the gates, and you find yourself once again walking the familiar path back toward the village. The air grows cooler as you approach the brewery where you began your journey. Workers are already preparing for the next day's batches, and you can hear the faint sound of singing from the square. You take a deep breath, the scent of malt and the Nile mingling together, and realize how much there still is to learn about beer's place in this world. You return to the familiar brewery just as twilight settles over the village. The brewers greet you warmly, their linen garments now flecked with flour and barley dust. One of them motions for you to follow him into a quieter corner of the compound, where an elderly healer is seated on a low stool. Beside her are baskets filled with herbs-dried flowers and small clay jars of beer. Tonight, you'll see another side of this drink, its role as medicine. The healer beckons you closer, her gnarled hands busy crushing dried myrrh with a smooth stone pestle. She mixes the powder into a cup of beer, explaining that it will soothe a patient's stomach. You glance at the mixture skeptically, but she smiles knowingly. Beer carries the medicine, she says softly, and makes the bitter herbs easier to swallow. You nod, realizing how clever this is. She shows you other remedies, beer mixed with crushed garlic for chest infections, beer steeped with chamomile to calm restless sleep, beer blended with honey to heal wounds. Historians still argue how effective these concoctions were, but you can see how important they are to the community. In a world with no pharmacies or antibiotics, these brews are the closest thing to medicine they have. A young boy limps into the compound, clutching his swollen ankle. The healer examines it and reaches for a jar of beer infused with willow bark. She pours a little over the injury, then hands the boy a small cup to drink. He winces at the bitter taste, but swallows bravely. You watch as she wraps his ankle with strips of linen, murmuring a prayer to Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of healing. Nearby, another brewer tells you about a common treatment for snakebites beer mixed with ground onions and a dash of resin from the acacia tree. He laughs softly, admitting that it may not cure the bite, but at least it distracts the patient from the pain. You grimace at the thought, and silently hope you won't need to test the theory. As the healer works, she explains that beer is also used as a base for certain cosmetics. Women mix it with oils and herbs to create skin treatments, while men sometimes rub it into their hair to keep it soft. You raise an eyebrow at this, imagining someone casually pouring beer over their head, and she chuckles at your expression. You're invited to sample a cup of chamomile-infused beer, said to ease tension and promote sleep. The flavor is delicate floral and only slightly bitter. You sip slowly, feeling a gentle warmth spread through your chest. Perhaps there's something to the healer's claims after all. The brewers join the healer at her small fire, listening as she shares old stories about how beer was once believed to be a gift from the gods, not just for sustenance, but for protection against illness. She tells a tale of Sekhmet, who in her fury nearly destroyed humanity. According to legend, the gods brewed vats of beer, dyed red to resemble blood, and tricked Sekhmet into drinking it. She grew so drunk and sleepy that she abandoned her plan of destruction, sparing humankind. You smile at the thought of beer saving the world. One brewer remarks that the legend is a reminder beer, when shared wisely, is a blessing. When overindulged, a danger. He glances toward a man who is already snoring in the corner after one too many cups, and the group chuckles softly. As the night deepens, the healer finishes her work and packs away her herbs. She pats your hand before leaving, reminding you that the body and spirit are as connected as the Nile and its banks. You think about how beer flows through both a humble drink carrying weight far beyond its simple ingredients. The brewers begin preparing small jars of beer to send to nearby villages in need. Some will be used as medicine, others as offerings at temple rituals. You help load the jars onto a wooden sledge, the clay cool against your fingers. Each jar feels like a link in a chain stretching outward, connecting countless lives along the Nile. As you step back, you catch sight of the temple priests arriving to collect the final offerings for the gods. Their solemn faces soften slightly as they see the familiar jars, and you understand that even here, in the shadow of divinity, beer is a bridge between worlds. You find yourself once again in the quiet courtyard where you first witnessed fermentation. The vats are still their work complete, and the air smells faintly of malt. You sit on a low bench, sipping the last of your chamomile beer, and watch the stars emerge one by one in the vast Egyptian sky. You realize that beer isn't just nourishment or medicine or ritual. It's woven into the fabric of life, a comfort in sickness, a companion in celebration, and a final gift to the dead. And as you set down your cup, you feel a deeper respect for the humble drink that has carried you this far. The next morning, you find yourself once again standing at the riverbank, the Nile flowing lazily past as the sun creeps above the horizon. The boats are being loaded again, this time not just with beer for the nearby temples and households, but for communities farther upriver. You join the crew as they prepare to set off the rhythmic clinking of jars, mingling with the chatter of boatmen and the cries of gulls overhead. As the barge pushes away from the dock, you settle on a coil of rope and watch the world slide by. On either side of the river, green fields shimmer with barley and wheat, broken occasionally by clusters of date palms. Fishermen and small reed boats wave as you pass, calling out greetings. You don't entirely understand, but return with a smile anyway. The head boatman explains that these beer shipments are essential for trade. Towns and villages along the Nile exchange goods, grain, papyrus, linen pottery, and beer is often part of the bargain. It's not just a drink, it's a form of currency, trusted and valued everywhere. You imagine someone handing over a jar of beer in exchange for a basket of figs, and the simplicity of the transaction makes you smile. As you drift past a bustling riverside market, the boatman points out a row of stalls where merchants will sell some of the beer to travelers. You can see the jars lined up in neat rows, their clay seals glinting in the sunlight. Customers haggle over prices, and the merchants seem as skilled in negotiation as the brewers are in their craft. Historians still argue how much beer influenced Egypt's economy, but watching the busy scene, you suspect its impact was enormous. The barge docks briefly at a small village, and you help unload several jars. The scribe accompanying you checks each seal carefully, ensuring none have been tampered with. One jar is missing its stamp, and he frowns, setting it aside for investigation. Beer theft, he explains, is taken seriously. A stolen jar could mean a family goes without rations, or a temple misses its offering. You nod, understanding why even small mistakes have large consequences here. The villagers greet you warmly, offering bread and dried dates as thanks for the delivery. You sit with them for a short while, listening to their stories. One man tells you about a distant flood that destroyed his fields last year, and how the arrival of beer from other communities helped his family survive. Another explains that beer isn't just sustenance. It's a way to celebrate life's milestones, births, marriages, even funerals. You realize again how deeply this humble drink is woven into every aspect of existence. Back on the barge, the crew resumes its journey. You pass ruins of older settlements, their mud brick walls crumbling slowly back into the desert. The boatman tells you these places were once thriving towns, but the river shifted its course, leaving them abandoned. You glance at the jars of beer at your feet and wonder how many generations have made this same journey, relying on the Nile's current to carry their cargo. As the sun climbs higher, the boatmen stop to rest beneath a cluster of palms along the riverbank. They share cups of beer and slices of bread, inviting you to join them. The beer is warm, but it quenches your thirst, and the simple meal tastes better than any feast. You sit in the shade, listening to the soft rustle of palm fronds and the gentle splash of the river. One of the older boatmen tells a story about a legendary shipment of beer that was once lost in a storm. He swears the gods themselves reclaimed it, and some say the jars still rest at the bottom of the Nile, untouched for centuries. You chuckle at the tale, but can't help glancing at the water's surface, half expecting to see an ancient jar bob to the top. The journey continues into the late afternoon. You pass more villages, more fields, more reminders of how beer connects communities across the land. At one stop, you witness a lively trade jars of beer exchanged for bundles of papyrus, baskets of pomegranates, and a small herd of goats. The scribe records everything carefully, his reed pen scratching steadily against the papyrus scroll. As the barge approaches its final destination, the boatman points to a large temple complex visible on the horizon. He explains that this temple is one of the biggest beer consumers in all of Egypt. The priests will use it for offerings, festivals, and to feed the temple workers. You remember the solemn rituals you witnessed earlier and imagine the jars of beer being carried into the temple's shadowed halls. The boat docks just as the sun begins to dip, casting the temple in a golden glow. Priests in white linen robes greet the crew, and the jars are unloaded with care. You watch as the seals are checked, the jars counted, and the beer stored away in a cool, shaded chamber. The head priest thanks the boatman and offers a blessing for safe travels home. As you step back onto the barge, you feel a quiet satisfaction. You've seen how beer nourishes, heals, and comforts, but now you understand how it sustains entire networks of trade and connection. The Nile may be Egypt's lifeblood, but beer, you realize, is its heartbeat, pulsing steadily from one community to the next. The boat turns upriver, and you settle in for the return journey, the evening breeze cool against your skin. In the distance, you can already see the faint glow of the village fires waiting to welcome you back. The evening air is warm and soft as the barge glides silently back toward the village. You sit near the bow, the rhythmic splash of the Nile against the hull soothing your senses. The jars are empty now, delivered to temples, families, and work sites. What remains is the comfort of knowing that the work, this endless cycle of cultivation, brewing, and sharing, has brought life and connection to countless people along the river. By the time the barge docks, the village is glowing with lantern light. You follow the brewers back through the familiar gates of the compound, their steps slower now, the day's labor finally weighing on their shoulders. The vats are quiet, the courtyard calm, and the air is filled with the faint scent of drying grain. One of the brewers places a reassuring hand on your shoulder and leads you toward a bench near the fire pit where the soft glow of embers still burns. The head brewer appears carrying a fresh jar, its clay seal recently broken. He pours cups of beer for everyone, handing one to you with a tired smile. You cradle it in your hands, feeling the warmth seep into your palms. The beer is smoother than you remember, the flavors mellowed by time and care. You sip slowly, savoring the sweet malt and the faint tang of the yeast. Around you, the brewers talk quietly about the next harvest and the upcoming festivals. One jokes about how many jars they'll need to prepare for the Pharaohs' inspectors. Another wonders whether they should experiment with adding more dates to the next batch. You chuckle softly, realizing how these conversations mirror the ones you've heard from farmers, healers, and priests. Everyone, it seems, is bound together by this humble drink. A young apprentice slips away and returns carrying a small basket of bread. He offers it around, and you accept a piece, dipping it into your beer, just as you saw the villagers do. The combination is comforting, the bread soaking up the sweet liquid like a sponge. As you chew slowly, you think about how many meals have looked exactly like this over the centuries, and how many more will follow. The conversation around the fire softens as the night deepens. The brewers lean back against the walls, cups and hand eyes half closed. You hear the faint sound of music drifting in from the village square, a gentle melody carried on the breeze. It mingles with the soft crackle of the fire, creating a lullaby that settles over the courtyard. The head brewer raises his cup in a quiet toast, not to the gods or the pharaoh, but simply to each other. You join him, lifting your own cup and feeling a sense of belonging you hadn't expected. It's a reminder that beer isn't just about sustenance or ritual. It's about community, about the small moments of connection that make life along the Nile feel complete. You take one last sip, the flavors lingering as you set your cup down and lean back against the bench. The stars overhead shimmer like grains of sand scattered across the night sky, and you feel the weight of your eyelids growing heavier with each breath. The night grows still, the sounds of the village fading into a soft, distant hum. You close your eyes and imagine the gentle flow of the Nile, the same river that has shaped lives for countless generations. Its waters nourish the barley fields, fill the vats, and carry the jars from one community to another. That rhythm, steady and eternal, feels like a heartbeat beneath the surface of the world. You picture the fields bathed in moonlight, the stalks of barley swaying gently in the breeze. Somewhere, farmers sleep with full bellies and content hearts, knowing the harvest is safely stored. Priests rest in temples that smell faintly of incense and malt, their offerings accepted for another day. Families gather in their mud brick homes, sharing bread and beer as they tell stories to their children. And in the silent necropolis, jars of beer stand quietly in tombs, waiting to nourish the souls of those who've passed. Everything you realize is connected by the simplest of things: a handful of grain, a careful hand, and the patience to let time work its quiet magic. Beer is more than a drink. It is the thread that binds life along the Nile together. Your breathing slows as you lean further into the bench, the warmth of the fire, a memory now fading into the cool night air. Each breath feels deeper, more peaceful, as though the river's rhythm has seeped into your own. The stars seem brighter now, but softer somehow, inviting you to rest. The breeze whispers against your skin, carrying with it the faint scent of barley and date syrup. You let it lull you further into stillness, further into quiet, until all that remains is calm, sweet dreams.